All right, well, I'm Professor Engelhardt, and we're continuing our series on the principles of macroeconomics. And in this video, we're going to introduce the aggregate supply and aggregate demand model. The next several videos will be about this approach to how we can look at macroeconomics. So let's go ahead and take a look. So the big question that we're trying to answer with this model is what causes economic fluctuations? And specifically, how can we use something like a supply and demand framework to understand business cycles? After all, supply and demand is something that we understand pretty well from microeconomics. It's a well-known framework, very heavily connected with economics, so maybe we can do something like it, right, to understand how business cycles work. So that is really kind of the goal of an aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework, for us to talk about this type of issue, this macroeconomic issue, on more familiar ground. So the basic question then is, what is it that explains the changes we see in real GDP and price levels as economic fluctuations occur? Now, there is definitely debate about this. So on the one hand, right, we have those that believe that it's really largely supply-driven. This is sometimes called the neoclassical view. Neo for new, right? Classical, that is, it's classical, so it's kind of an old way of looking at things. So it's a new twist, right, on this old idea that really it's supply that is driving economic fluctuations. The second view would be a demand-driven view. This is the Keynesian view coming out of the work of John Maynard Keynes, largely in the 1930s during the Great Depression, or the Great Slump, as they called it over in the United Kingdom where he was working. And he really thought it was demand that was driving things. And then finally, there's another view, which I would call a coordination-driven view. This would be often associated with the Austrian School of Economics. Unfortunately, the Austrian School of Economics is not going to feature much in this video because they tend not to accept the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework as being particularly useful. But we will look at the other two. So I want to start then with Say's law. So Say's law, if we really boil it down, this comes from an economist by the name of Say, and it is often described as supply creates its own demand. This type of summary actually goes back to John Maynard Keynes. Now, this is not at all the way that Say himself, right, stated this law. What he was really saying is that when you have an economy, for you to be able to consume, you have to first have production. Right? I cannot consume something that was not produced in the first place. This then also means that an increase in production increases the possibility of consumption happening. After all, if you have produced, I don't know, a new board game or something like that, that creates the possibility of me then consuming that board game. If you do not do that, then I cannot possibly consume it. Right? So it's really a supply-based view in thinking that fundamentally what matters is production. Now, we do want to be careful not taking this too far. Right? Say does acknowledge that we need some proportionality in production. That is, it might be we can produce a lot of stuff, but it's the wrong stuff. That doesn't necessarily mean the economy is healthy. But the big point he wants to make is that in this view, recessions would not be caused by a general overproduction, that is, we're just producing too much stuff on the whole, or flip it around, underconsumption, as people just aren't buying enough stuff on the whole. Rather, it's we produced the wrong stuff. Now, neoclassicals today, kind of taking that production supply driven framework, would place an emphasis on supply side factors. We'll talk more about these later, and on the idea that we should expand what we call potential output or potential GDP. Right? So it would be really a focus on the kinds of things that are associated with economic growth over the long term. Things like, do we have labor, and does our labor have sufficient human capital, training, education, and the like? Are we building up our physical capital stock? Do we have the factories, the machinery, the tools that we need to have a growing economy and a prosperous economy? Do we have development in technology? Are we innovating? Are we inventing? Right, so all of these elements work together, right, then to focus on the supply side of the economy, and that's really what the neoclassicals would emphasize. Now, we can divide the neoclassicals up into a couple of different schools, right? So one school we would call the new classicals. These were the ones that were largely associated with Robert Lucas and some of his work. And then we also have real business cycle theory. There's a kind of a crowd of folks associated with that. What they have in common is they really do think about the supply side as being very important in explaining how business cycles work. So just as a simple example, real business cycle theory, when they look at business cycles, what they suggest is that they're really driven by changes in productivity that are relatively short-lived. So you have a sudden change in productivity, and that sets up a cyclical pattern as we adjust to that change in productivity. There's also an emphasis amongst neoclassicals today on the self-correcting process, right? So while we may have the economy enter a recession, recessions will in fact solve themselves, right? So we allow for economies to adjust, and we won't end up stuck in a depression forever if we let those processes happen. Now, in contrast, we have the Keynesian view. And this is a simplified view, a simplified statement of Keynes's law, so to speak. That is, that demand creates its own supply. So what Keynes was really saying here was that he believed it was possible for economies to fall below their potential production levels. That is, we could have under consumption, leading then to what looked like overproduction. Right? So the reason here being that an increase in production is going to follow an increase in spending. Right? So what you end up with, okay, how do we fall below our potential production levels? Well, people stop spending. Eventually, businesses catch on to this, and they stop producing. But now, I would note, Keynes does acknowledge there are limits to this, especially on the upside, right? So he really proposes the economy has two different modes that it operates in. We'll talk more about this in a later video. That is, on the one hand, we sometimes operate with full employment. That is, there isn't a lot of slack in the economy. Pretty much anybody who wants a job can find one. Then other times we operate in depression mode. And what consequences you get from policy, so things like, say, welfare or work programs, is going to depend radically on the mode that we're in. You get very different results if you try to put a jobs program into a full employment economy versus a depression economy. So Keynes's, I guess, his descendants today in terms of economic thought, right, would put more emphasis on the demand side factors. So if you want to understand how the economy works according to them, they would say you need to look at consumption, investment, government, net exports, all these different categories of spending. They will help us to understand how the economy works. You'll also see more emphasis placed on stabilizing measures during a recession. That is, this idea that government should step in if we're in a recession and try to stabilize things, prevent it from getting worse, or potentially get us out of it. Now, I think most economists today combine these two approaches. On the one hand, you tend to see more of a Keynesian approach to the short run, both theoretically and also often in terms of policy. Then also you take a neoclassical approach more in the long run. So when we think about things like how to get the economy to grow over long periods of time, the neoclassical or supply side approach tends to be what you see. On the other hand, if we're thinking about, well, the economy is falling apart right now, what do we do about it? We tend to see more of a Keynesian approach taken. Now, to understand the aggregate supply side, as we're moving into thinking about the supply and demand framework, we need to first understand the idea of potential GDP. So potential GDP, the way we define it, is that it is the sustainable level of GDP in the long term based on the resources we have available. So that would be things like labor, capital, technology, and also political and cultural institutions. So this is something that will change, right, over time, but it tends to change somewhat slowly. Then we have aggregate supply then. We describe how much firms will produce and sell in the aggregate in response to changes in the price level. So let's get into what these look like. So the general shape of aggregate supply is that as the price level increases, we tend to see greater production or a greater real GDP, denoted here as Y. So the size of that impact, though, really depends on where we are compared to potential GDP. Right, so note the curvature here as I've graphed it. If your aggregate supply is, if your real GDP is well below the potential, aggregate supply tends to be quite flat. That is to say, right, a small increase in prices can lead to very large increases in how much production we see. On the other hand, once we get past potential GDP, we tend to see an extremely steep relationship. That is, it takes a very large increase in the price level to see much increase in real GDP at all. A lot of that is just reflecting the fact that we're bumping up against our productive capacity. So this is how we can summarize that. Right? So if our GDP is below its potential, we have lots of slack in the economy, we're operating below capacity, which means even a small increase in prices is enough for us to see a large increase in output, or real GDP. If, on the other hand, real GDP is above potential GDP, resources are getting tight. We'd say, for example, that the level of unemployment is below the natural rate of unemployment. We're operating at capacity, or at least close to it, so even a large increase in price is not enough to get much of a change in real GDP. Now, if our real GDP is way beyond our potential GDP, then we eventually will reach absolute capacity. Aggregate supply becomes perfectly vertical because we simply do not have the resources to produce more. For example, everybody has a job. Once everybody has a job and we're employing them as well as we possibly can, there's nothing we can do to produce more than we already are. Now, on the aggregate demand side, here we think about production and its connection with the price level, but through expenditure. Right? So we're looking at that consumption, investment, government purchases, and net exports is really the foundation here. Now, the shape of this curve is going to come from three effects: the wealth effect, the interest rate effect, and the foreign price effect. Let's look at each of those. The wealth effect suggests that as prices rise, right, that means that we, as consumers, are going to feel poorer. The reason, quite simply, is that the $5 bill I have in my pocket can't buy nearly as much when prices are high as when prices are low. Right, so because I see a lower real value of my savings, or a lower purchasing power of the wealth that I have, I feel poorer if I see the general level of prices rise. If I feel poorer, I try not to spend so much, so we'll see a decrease in consumption. The interest rate effect actually ends up with a similar result, but through a different pathway. That is, as prices go up, people are going to try to keep buying a lot of the stuff they normally want to buy, but now they're going to have to take out more loans to do it. This increases the demand for loans, but as there's a greater demand for loans, the price of those loans, that is, the interest rate, is going to get increased. So as we see higher interest rates are then going to discourage people from taking these loans out, so we'll see lower consumption and also lower investment, as a lot of things like building factories would count as investment, building homes counts as investment. If interest rates are high, we don't want to do those things quite so much. Then we have the foreign price effect. So suppose the prices in the US go up. Well, in that case, as an American, I want to buy cheap goods from abroad. Those things made here are more expensive, so I'm going to import more. On the other hand, if I'm a foreigner and I see the prices of American-made goods have gone up, I'll buy less of those goods. So we'll see in the US, our imports go up, our exports decline, which means my net exports are certainly going to fall through either, actually both, of these pathways. Now note, every single one of these reinforces. That is, the higher the price level goes, the lower our planned spending will be, either because we feel poorer, so we lower our consumption. It's more expensive for us to do anything funded by debt, so we lower consumption and investment, or we end up exporting less and importing more. That lowers our net exports. Now, I will say, though, the sizes and honestly the existence of some of these effects are somewhat controversial. So this means it's probably likely that none of these effects are really, really very strong, so the aggregate demand is probably fairly steep. That is to say, right, if you see higher prices, you get a drop in consumption, but it's not an enormous drop in consumption. So here's how we put it all together. So we have potential GDP as a vertical line indicating the maximum sustainable level of production. Our short-run aggregate supply, we're just calling it aggregate supply here, has that curvature to it as it goes from relatively flat to relatively steep as real GDP increases. And then we have aggregate demand, a fairly steep downward sloping line, indicating at higher price levels we're going to generally have less expenditure. So how does traditional microeconomic supply and demand relate with aggregate supply and aggregate demand? Well, remember, traditional supply and demand is a micro concept. That is to say, it applies to prices in quantities for individual goods. So the price of tea, the price of gasoline, the price of housing in a particular area. So it's all these fairly specific goods that we're dealing with, or services as well. While aggregate supply and aggregate demand, these are macro concepts. And what really makes macro macro is the aggregation process. So when we look at price level, it means overall the price level is increased. It may not be true for each individual good, but on the whole, the cost of living, right, has gone up. Or real GDP, right? What we have along our horizontal axis, it's aggregate production. So again, this doesn't mean that each individual business is selling and producing more. It simply means when we add everything together, that things have increased as we move from left to right along that horizontal axis. Now, in terms of using the tools, finding equilibrium is very similar. We will have shifts in these curves, and the shifts in aggregate supply and aggregate demand will feel a lot like typical supply and demand. Similarly, we're going to see impacts that look very similar. However, the causes are going to be different. So those things that say shift an individual supply curve may not necessarily fit a shift an aggregate supply curve. Now, another kind of quick note, you can use aggregate supply and aggregate demand, those two curves, to find your equilibrium, and then comparing that to potential GDP tells you whether you're in a recession or an expansion. Just compare your equilibrium real GDP with the potential GDP. If our actual GDP is less than the potential, it's a recession. If we're greater than the potential, then we're in expansion. Now, I do want to provide just a slight shift in terminology. That is short-run aggregate supply and long-run aggregate supply. These are really the same concepts as what so far I've called aggregate supply and potential GDP. So I'm just going to swap those out occasionally. I think in this video I basically stay consistent with talking about aggregate supply being the short-run version and then potential GDP is the long-run version, but I might swap it out, just so you're aware of that. We consider these to be equivalent terms. So shifts then in aggregate supply. So what does that look like? So for productivity can have an impact on aggregate supply, that is our ability to produce at a particular price level. And productivity has an impact both on long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply. So if, say, we become more productive, we'd see both of these shift to the right, indicating a greater ability to produce at any price level. Another thing that it creates a shift in aggregate supply would be input prices. So here we talk sometimes about things like oil shocks, as there's a significant increase in the price of oil, and we know oil plays a big role in the economy. Well, in that case, we would have a shift in the short-run aggregate supply curve, not necessarily in the long-run aggregate supply, because just because oil is expensive doesn't mean that it's suddenly not available anymore, right? So in the long run, we would expect things to work out, but in the short run, things have gotten much more difficult in terms of production. Now, there are also a number of other things that could have an impact. Really, anything that affects our ability to produce has an impact here. So things like if we have widespread labor disputes, so a lot of, say, labor unions are striking or something like that, we tend not to see that so much at a macro level in the US, but some countries do, ones that have, say, stronger labor protections. But here in the US, one thing we did see was COVID lockdowns. We saw these in many countries around the world where now we're not allowed to produce. Legally, certain businesses are shut down because they're considered non-essential, right? So that would certainly be something that would have an impact on the aggregate supply curve in the short term. Now on the aggregate demand side, we'll talk about this more on a later video when I focus more on the Keynesian view. But for now, I do want to emphasize two things, right? One is that any change in consumer or investor behavior that is not based on what's happening with the price level can create a shift in aggregate demand. So just kind of a classic one would be confidence, right? So if our consumers are feeling much more confident in their level of wealth, much more confident about the economy, that will often make people inclined to consume more. And that would be a change in aggregate demand. Investors, similarly. Investors can sometimes be a bit skittish, right? Or we can see herd behavior amongst investors at times, right? And when that happens, right, we become more confident. Now we're willing to build the new factories. We're willing to do these types of things. On the other hand, if I'm not feeling so confident, we stop building the factories and such. Right? So investment is going to rely in part on our confidence about the future. Also, changes in government policy will have an impact. So taxes and spending, interest rate policy, these are things that will have an impact. Right? So for example, if, say, we increase income tax rates, well, now people can't consume so much, right? So we tend to see a drop in consumption because of this change in government policy, right? Or government spending has an impact on that G in the C plus I plus G plus NX equation. And so if the government decides to spend more money, G goes up, that would tend to be an increase in aggregate demand. On the other hand, if G goes down, we'd see the opposite happen. Now I do want to just comment real quick, one thing that doesn't fit easily into the aggregate supply, aggregate demand framework is unemployment. But honestly, it's not that hard to put it in. So there's this concept we call the GDP gap, which was already implicit in some of the things we've talked about. So the GDP gap is the difference between your potential GDP and your actual GDP. So if our actual GDP is below potential GDP, then there's a gap there. Now, if actual GDP is above potential GDP, then there's a gap, although it would be considered a negative gap. That is, we're beyond what we could sustainably produce. All right, so how does this relate to unemployment? Generally speaking, we believe that when our GDP is equal to its long-term potential, that means that our unemployment rate is going to be equal to the natural rate of unemployment. So somewhere in between 4 and 5%, we think now for the United States. On the other hand, if GDP is less than the potential GDP, that is, we could produce more, one thing that tends to go along with that is that unemployment tends to be higher than the natural rate. That is, we have some level of cyclical unemployment. On the other hand, if GDP is above or beyond our potential GDP, then unemployment tends to be below the natural rate. Right? That is, we in effect have negative cyclical unemployment. So people who may not be totally qualified for work, nonetheless, we're hiring them into these positions and hoping to train them, that kind of thing, because we simply need workers so badly. We would also see a decrease in, say, frictional type unemployment. It's very easy to find a job in these kinds of situations. Now, these relate to each other through what we call Okun's law. Now, Okun's law, we shouldn't get too confused about it being called a law, right? And that it is not something that must be true. This is instead just kind of a regularity in the data that was observed by an economist, shockingly, named Okun, where they found that the GDP gap seems to be equal to about 2 times the rate of cyclical unemployment. So if you have a 2% GDP gap, that is, our GDP is 2% below potential, then that translates into a 1 percentage point of cyclical unemployment. So it's this kind of 2-to-1 ratio. 2 percentage points of GDP gap are associated with 1% of cyclical unemployment. So one last thing that we can do is we can identify in our short-run aggregate supply various what we would call zones. And so on the left side of the graph, we have a very flat aggregate supply. Here, the world acts very much like the Keynesians would suggest. That is, where our aggregate demand falls is going to have a big impact on what our real GDP is within that range. On the other hand, if we're on the far right of this diagram, where aggregate supply is extremely steep, well, in that case, what's really the limiting factor is our ability to produce. Right? So that would be the neoclassical region. Right? So we have these two regions reflecting these two philosophies. Now, most of the time, I think it's fair to say, we operate in between the two. Right? So we're in this intermediate region where there's this gradual change in the trade-off so that we may be able to get higher real GDP, but we do so at higher price levels until eventually we hit our potential GDP and the neoclassical dynamics become more important there. And so this is just a way of demonstrating how these different philosophies relate to each other. The Keynesian and the neoclassical views really kind of describing different states of the economy. Now, I will kind of say as a side note, this is actually a Keynesian view of how they fit together. After all, Keynes is the one that said, really, there are two types of economy. There's the depression economy, and there's the full employment economy, and he just talked about the depression economy a lot. That's why low real GDP, it would be what would be labeled Keynesian here, but it's not like he didn't acknowledge, right, the ability of the other to exist. So, I just wanted to lay that out there. So let's wrap things up. So just some final notes. I think just in terms of reflection, aggregate supply and aggregate demand allows for a good first pass at how the macroeconomy works. We can pull out this framework, we can shift aggregate demand, we can shift aggregate supply the way that we're used to doing, shift left, shift right to show increases and decreases, exactly the way that things work in a microeconomic supply and demand framework. However, we also need to keep in mind that a lot of these elements are controversial in a way that the microeconomic elements aren't as controversial, right? So, and here I mentioned toward the beginning, like even the question of whether this level of aggregation is useful, right, is something that there's some debate about, right? So I think it's important to kind of keep that in mind as we go forward, that there is a lot more doubt about this particular framework than about the standard supply and demand framework you'd find in a microeconomics course.